All right, we'll be bringing on our next presenters. So that's Ash and Salma, and based in Melbourne from RMIT University. So they should be coming on soon. Boom, there we go. Oh, I'll hand over to you guys. Cheers.
Awesome. Start our video. Okay, can you see us?
Yep, can see you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. We'll start this presentation. Can you see that now?
Yep, bang on. Cheers.
Okay, beautiful. So this was, Ryan, I absolutely loved your presentation and it prefaced ours really, really nicely. And it's funny because in the situation that I'm in, I'm quite often alone as the neuroscientist, but Salma was my student last year in what I believe would be a fairly equivalent course to what you were describing in that neuroscience, neurophysiology kind of course. And we were literally laughing out loud going, oh my gosh, Ryan is me in a man's body. And I always was saying that my background is in obviously neuroscience, but from a motor control perspective. So my background's exercise science. And this whole entire project came up because of my expertise in learning, but learning from motor skill perspective. So we teach people like physical education students and exercise science students who are going on to do rehabilitation or strength and conditioning. And so situations where they would be learning motor skills at all spectrums, from very young children with your fundamental motor skills right through to elderly who might be, needing EP because of falls risks or whatever the case may be. But the thing that was interesting for me and how this project came about was that learning really is the same regardless of what you're learning. And so I would apply neuroscience principles of learning to the way that I would teach every subject that I ever teach. And so that's really the basis of all of this. And there were a few things that came up in presentations that I've watched in the last couple of days. And one was a lot of talk around assessment and dropping exams and embracing understanding of content rather than recall. And Salma literally turned around before and said, oh my gosh, he dropped the M word, of metacognition. So the other thing that we were kind of giggling about is you've spoken a lot about the students self-reporting, and that is really, really helpful because we know that from that perspective, it's really important that the students believe that they are understanding things better. And that was a big focus of our project. But unfortunately, students are inherently unreliable at self-reporting. So this is really the background of how this project came about. And what I had observed in the past was that never ever in our exercise science context would we give people a training program and then at the end of their training program assess them to see how much they've improved. It would just never happen because that last assessment is not meaningful. We don't know what they were able to do at the start. We don't know where they were coming from. And so having these final exams and final assessments was really unhelpful in those motor skill situations. And so I became really frustrated going, why do we have these final exams and these final assessments when I don't know where the students, what they knew to begin with? And I remember it was actually Brain Trust a few years ago when a presenter had said that they had done this elaborate study, and the only thing, literally the only thing that predicted their performance at the end of a subject was their GPA going into the course. And so that really stuck in my mind, and I wanted to kind of unpack that a little bit. So this is Salma. As I mentioned, she was a student in my course the year prior, where all of this had started to come about in my teaching modalities. And I had cooked up this project in my head. So it's going to be a little bit more of a formal presentation, like research, because this was her research this year. And I might jump in here and there as we go. Okay, So learning versus performance in higher education. Go for it.
Great. So I'd like to begin this presentation by presenting you with a statement. Students' abilities to evaluate their own learning is underdeveloped. Typically, academic performance is measured acutely, and if the performance standard meets a predetermined set of criteria, then it's assumed that learning has occurred. It's obvious that the concepts of learning and performance are related, but they're not the same thing. That is, learning may have occurred even if the acute performance was poor, and excellent acute performance does not necessarily indicate a higher level of learning. There are a number of factors that can influence acute performance that are independent of what has been learnt. Nonetheless, grades are an important aspect of the higher education system because they evaluate students' performance. So can we measure learning through a better performance assessment model? One way to quantify true learning is to take measurements at various points in time. This depicts learning as the distance travelled by McGrath and colleagues, and the learning gain model shown here measures the change in student performance relating to a specific area of knowledge between 2 points. Understanding learning gain can pave the way for optimizing assessment practices to not only assess for learning, but to ensure the assessment of learning. So there is no question that exams or tests, especially consisting of multiple choice questions or MCQ, are favoured by academic staff to measure performance. This could be because testing can be a tool for learning and not just evaluation. There may be some benefits to students too, depending on the delivery and feedback modality. However, exams are also known to prohibit structured planning, only test recall memory, and when delivered just once, only provide a cross-sectional evaluation of student performance. Overall, this means that using tests to infer knowledge may be problematic. However, the adverse can also be true, a phenomenon known as the testing effect. When students are exposed to a test and there is any kind of feedback, whether it be a score or feedback with written, like verbal cues, their scores improve just by redoing the same test. This shows it is important to control for these aspects when assessing learning, especially by not giving specific feedback or any indication of correctness of responses. So another point of interest was the influence that personality type can have on learning and performance. So there is some evidence that suggests a link between personality traits and success in school. And many scholars have acknowledged the 5-factor model of personality, or the FFM, as a uniform and acceptable taxonomy of personality. The FFM is a hierarchical organization of personality traits in terms of 5 basic dimensions. So that's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And each of these 5 factors exists on a scale. So it can be high or low, not present or absent. So with that, the aims of the study were to objectively measure learning gain and subjectively measure perceived learning amongst a 3rd-year exercise and sports science cohort, and to identify any relationships between these measures. Additionally, we aimed to determine whether perceived or actual learning were influenced by personality type. We hypothesized that objective and subjective measures would improve over time, indicating that learning had occurred, and that there would be a discrepancy between changes in subjective and objective measures of learning over time. Finally, we hypothesized that personality factors would influence learning gains. So to tackle this study, the experiment was divided into 2 sections. And for experiment 1, 25 students from a 3rd-year motor control course within the exercise sports science degree at RMIT University were pulled to participate. And note that the age is not reported here because it was deemed irrelevant personal information by the ethics committee.
Okay, so for this one, we used a within subject design. So the motor control course was completed as per the syllabus. The important thing about this experimental design is that I delivered the course exactly as I had previously designed it for every other semester. So a lot of similar kinds of aspects in terms of the syllabus. We have some tutorial that are theory-based, some practical classes that reinforce the theory. So the tutorials were all run on LT as well as our practicals, but we focused on the theoretical content for this particular project. So the student data from the lessons was included in the analyses, and the way that the class happened in the middle that was then analysed was that basically the students would each complete the LT lesson, and then I would personally inbox extension questions to each individual student. So what that would do is I would ask them to focus on not what is the right answer, but why. And that was another thing that Ryan spoke about this morning. So what I would actually do is we would then come together as a group, and each student would go through their allocated question to teach the class. We weren't interested in talking about the right answer. We were talking about why the other answers were wrong. And so that extended their knowledge and extended their ability to problem solve and to think and go, okay, so if that was wrong, why was it wrong? And what did you actually need to do to make that a right answer? So they were all really theoretically based. So what I kind of had started with previously was, at the start of a theory class, I would turn the course objectives or the lesson objectives into questions. So the lesson objectives for this particular lesson, this was at the start of our course. So the lesson objectives would have been related to understanding how the nervous system is organized, understanding how an action potential is generated, and so on. So we've got these little questions here. I could explain these in detail. I could describe the basic processes or principles, or I could not adequately answer these questions. The year previously, so when Salma was my student in 2019, this was actually part of every single lesson that I did. And what I observed was that there was a shift by the end of the lesson. There was a shift from students reporting that they couldn't adequately answer these questions, or that they could only describe the basic processes or principles at the beginning of the lesson. But then by the end of the lesson, there's been this shift towards some people saying that they could explain them in detail, some people saying that they could describe the basic processes or principles, and almost no one saying that they could no longer adequately answer the questions. But then I started to think, okay, so that's really nice. I guess qualitatively, the students are perceiving that they understand the content better, but I didn't have any kind of evidence to support that, any kind of quantitative evidence to show that not only did they think that they could explain this stuff in more detail, or that they understood it better, but did they actually know it? Like, could they actually perform better in some kind of assessment of that knowledge? So this was the extension of this. When we're talking about lesson reflection, or LR, in the results, this is what we're talking about. So what we could then do, it allowed me to identify the students who still, after the lesson, could not adequately answer those questions in relation to the lesson objectives. And I could determine who those students were and follow up with them directly. So the other aspect of this, and this was the extension of what I added to my course this year that I hadn't previously done. So I added a knowledge check and an assessment, self-assessment of their confidence in that knowledge check. Because another thing that I have an issue with is effectively that if we have a student who does perform better, it's, say, a multiple choice, I don't know whether they've picked that answer because they actually know it, or whether they've picked that answer because they have completely guessed. So for all of the questions that we've asked, this is one example here, but for all of the questions that we've asked at the beginning of the lesson and then repeated the knowledge check at the end of the lesson with no feedback at all, was they had to rate their confidence in that answer. So the example that I've got here, I'm not confident, it was just a guess, and I am so I'm a little confident. This was the knowledge check before any of the actual lesson had occurred. And then at the end of the lesson, you can see for the same question, we've only got one person who is still saying that they're not at all confident and it was just a guess. So the overview of the procedure of this is displayed here. The data was pulled for 3 of our 2-hour theoretical-based tutorial classes. And this was, so we had the lesson reflection for the first time, the knowledge check and confidence for the first time. Then we had our actual class that was done in LT. Then they did the knowledge check and confidence again, and then the lesson reflection again. So,
awesome. So scores for each variable were combined to form an aggregate score that was used for analyses. And these aggregate values were used to determine percentage change scores for each student, and then again for each variable using the formula that's shown on the screen. And then a small amount of missing data that arose from accidentally missed responses. Oh my God, I just lost where I was.
That's okay. We're going to jump through this because we're a little bit
Yeah.
running out of time, but we did some stats. Let's leave it at that. We did some stats. Now, the extension to that was that we did the 5-factor model personality questionnaire, and we also did this in LT. So the students completed this, and again, we did some more stats. So what were our results? Okay. Okay, so do you want to go for it?
Each variable significantly improved by about 30%. And then we looked at this and thought, well, surely they must be related if they're all increasing by like a fairly similar amount. Well, we were very wrong. The regression analyses here showed almost no relationship, with the most notable being that knowledge check scores were able to explain 10% of the variance in the lesson reflection scores. However, all other regressions were negligible, and it's likely due to larger standard deviations. So what we did to try and better understand this was come up with a disparity index, and this allowed us to classify students based on their tendency to be either more overconfident or underconfident. And that's represented by the red bars and the green bars on the screen. And this is where we got really excited and desperately wished we had a lot more student responses. And then with the personality, whilst we fully acknowledged that we were significantly underpowered for anything that was really meaningful, our preliminary findings based upon the sample of 10 students who completed the personality questionnaire showed that openness was a moderate predictor of underconfidence. And that was explained by the 32% of the variance in the data. So as expected, within a single session, students' performance and confidence improved significantly after they had engaged with the learning material. However, the nature of the relationship observed between the changes between the variables showed that confidence scores were a weak predictor of test performance. And further, an examination of individual students showed that approximately half of the cohort had an inability to accurately self-report their own learning. And finally, it was identified that some personality types may be able to predict whether students are likely to underestimate or overestimate their performance. And these findings are important because metacognitive skills such as self-correctness and self-assessments could improve learning outcomes and inspire change in pedagogical approaches, which takes us back to the beginning of the presentation where we hope to help students develop the ability to evaluate their own learning. And also LT is a very effective tool for delivering this type of content. So we also just want to quickly acknowledge that there were many limitations with the study. Firstly, the sample size for both experiments was really too small to draw any definitive conclusions. And secondly, arguably the biggest limitation was the COVID-19 pandemic, which prompted our change, a couple of changes in our experimental design. And finally, the inclusion of data from only 3 lessons may have resulted in an inability to really capture important changes throughout the semester.
And we also finished with this. This was a statement from the course evaluation. I left the whole statement exactly as it was written. But the one thing that I really loved about this was I didn't feel like I was missing anything from face-to-face learning. And this is in a class that is done, is a very heavily practical component. It's very complex content that students typically go into it really, really worried because they think that it's going to be the hardest thing that they have to try and learn. And the LT lessons, the way that they were designed, delivered entirely remotely, but synchronously. The students didn't feel like they were missing anything from that face-to-face learning. So, yeah, I think that is really, really, what would you say? Hopefully reassuring. All righty, so I'll stop sharing.
Awesome, cheers to that. Yeah, bang on time. So yeah, and one thing that popped into mind is that, yeah, underpowered, you're saying, but this is where I feel like events like this can be quite useful, because, potentially you can be looking for collaborations, to build those end values with others. So yeah. As an option for people to maybe reach out or try and tee up collaborations.
Yeah.
But we do have one question that's come from D. I'll read it out for you now. So, did the students rate their ability to answer the questions for the individual questions or for the group of questions?
Every single individual question. So it went question, and then it went confidence for that question. New question, confidence for that question. So the knowledge check questions were identical at the start and end of the lesson, but the important thing was that they weren't even given an indication on whether their answer was right. They weren't given the opportunity to get feedback of that. And this is where we tried to identify differences between assessment for learning, where they do get feedback and they do have to try and change or learn themselves what the right answer would be or why something would be wrong. And then the assessment of learning. So without any sort of feedback, without any indication of whether they were right or wrong, but the same question presented again, which means that to get a different outcome, they had to actually change their answer as a result of an improved understanding of that concept. So we liked it. We thought it was pretty good. And Ryan, yeah, so the depth of understanding, I used to have a very high fail rate for this course, and I started implementing LT for that, well, not for that reason, but to try and help that. And I have a 0 fail rate now. So, and that's been consistent for the last 3 years that I've implemented LT.
Cool. All right, thanks for that. Need to move on to next presenter, but I just want to say great presentation.